Now that the NBA season has started and we've gotten an idea of which teams are good, which aren't, what kind of situation each of these teams are going to be in this season, it started to become clear that some of these players need a change of scenery. They need to be traded. First up on the list is someone you might not have expected, but I definitely feel like there needs to be a new opportunity for this player. He's actually not the only guy from his team that's going to be on the list, and it's Patrick Williams in Chicago. When I watch Bulls games, I barely even notice that Patrick Williams is even out there. This is a former top 5 pick. This is a guy that at times over the last few seasons, when he's been healthy, has shown flashes of a really, really good player. He's needed to grow offensively. He's needed to improve as a shooter. Yes, there are things that need to get better, but there's a physical profile here that really looked promising for Patrick Williams. And the situation in Chicago isn't ideal. And I'm not trying to say that he's going to suddenly become an unbelievable player somewhere else, but I do think that it's time they move on and they find a different situation for him. This happens sometimes with young players where you have your opportunity in your second or your third season to really grow and progress. And when that doesn't happen, you kind of get left behind. And I really feel like Chicago is not really paying that much attention anymore to trying to develop Patrick Williams. And if he was elsewhere, that opportunity for him would be much better. And I still think that there's plenty of talent there, especially on the defensive end of the floor. He certainly can still be a productive NBA player. And the way he's being utilized in Chicago right now, that's just not going to happen for him. Next up is one that I really considered whether to put him on the list or not, but I'm going to go for it. It's Julius Randle in New York. This is a situation where obviously Julius Randle is good. He helps him score, but it has been such a weird up and down situation for him in New York, where he's had seasons where he's been an all NBA caliber guy, and then he's had seasons where he's just looked terrible for, most of the season. And at the beginning of the year, he's been terrible. He's been awful. And now that they have, Jalen Brunson there and some other pieces, you start to wonder what this roster would look like if they had a Julius Randle level of assets in place of Julius Randle actually on the floor. Now, obviously, the Knicks are always going to be involved in potentially getting some stars, whether that be, some guys maybe we'll talk about later on in this video, or some guys that could potentially come available, later on here over the next few seasons. And Randle is someone that has always kind of felt like he's in the way of that, whether it be because of roster construction or salary. And I just think that now that they have Jalen Brunson, now that he is clearly the best guy on the team and they don't need to rely on whatever Julius Randle tries to do offensively, there are opportunities out there for them to move him. And mostly this would be for him just to find a new situation, because he is a talented player. And I just think that at a certain point, it makes sense for someone like this that's not playing particularly well, that has maybe not endeared himself to the fans a ton, to just find a new situation for himself. Next up now is one that I've talked about in a few videos, and that is Pascal Siakam in Toronto. Now, I wanted to see how Toronto was going to look to begin the season, what the Dennis Schroeder edition was going to look like, but the biggest issue here for Toronto by far is the fact that Pascal Siakam is a free agent. Like, he can leave this offseason, and I've said this in other videos. If him and Van Fleet leave in back-to-back off seasons in which Toronto gets nothing in exchange for those guys, that is 100% a disaster for Toronto. Like, that is as bad of a 2 off-season stretch as really any team has had, especially for a team in Toronto that is going to struggle to replace those guys, in free agency or otherwise. And it's really, really clear to me at this point that, considering that they haven't signed him to an extension, considering some of the comments that have been made, publicly, and some of the rumors privately, that Pascal Siakam's time in Toronto is over. And that is okay, because I still think that they can get value out of him to another team. They're not going to get a ton of first-round picks. They're not going to get a ton of young talent, but they are going to get some pieces that are going to help them build around whatever this, Scotty Barnes, OG Anunoby core is moving forward. And that's certainly going to be better than just losing Pascal Siakam for nothing in free agency. And that is the situation that Toronto is staring at right now. This needs to be something that they are aggressive with as we get towards the trade deadline. And the beginning of this season has not changed my mind at all in terms of where Toronto is heading. I understand that they want to try and still be a decent team. They want to try and tread water, and I get that, but it's just not going to happen with the way that this roster is constructed, even with a new coach. Even if, let's say that, they're a 500 team, a little better this year, and then they bring back Siakam as a free agent. Okay, so now you're paying a ton of money to Siakam when you could have gotten value for him, and your team still isn't going to be, even a top 5, top 6 team in the Eastern Conference from a record standpoint. To me, it doesn't make any sense to continue to bring him back, and they need to make a change. Next up now is the other Chicago Bull that I mentioned, earlier on in the video, and that is Zach LaVine. This Bulls team, I continually don't understand what they're trying to do there in terms of the front office, and I honestly think that, like, the entire roster is basically going to be available for trade by the time we get closer to the trade deadline. Interestingly, it's going to be kind of like how Orlando was a couple of years ago when they traded Vucevic to Chicago and they traded away Aaron Gordon to Denver. They're just going to be looking to completely reset the roster. I mean, LaVine can get them stuff, Vucevic can get them stuff, Patrick Williams can get them stuff, DeRozan can get them stuff, Caruso. Like, they have a handful of interesting, intriguing players that fit in other situations that for whatever reason right now just cannot put themselves in a situation to win games. And I don't know if it's because Lonzo isn't out there. I don't know if it's because of the coaching situation. I'm not sure. But at one point, this group plus Lonzo was really, really good, and they just aren't anymore. And I don't think that the front office has fully realized that yet, or they're concerned about losing their job, which makes total sense. But at some point, you do have to decide to do what is best for the franchise. And yeah, it might be cool to try and win 40 games this year, but ultimately that might be the ceiling of your team. And you have a player in Zach LaVine in this case that you can get some stuff for. I don't think you're going to get, a ton of future firsts or a ton of young talent. It's kind of like the Siakam thing because he's on an expiring, but for LaVine, it's because he's probably not as good as Siakam, and there's some injury stuff long-term that I think people are concerned about. But I think Philadelphia, New York, I think these are definitely teams that would be interested. Philadelphia with the new stuff that they got in exchange in the Harden trade, and then New York, which we talked about earlier, potentially moving off of Julius Randle. Julius Randle wouldn't go to Chicago, but there's some stuff out there for Chicago, I think, to try and move Zach LaVine, and it would really, really make sense for them to explore that. And then we get to me, what is the biggest storyline that not a lot of people are talking about this season, and that's Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland. Not a great start to the year for Cleveland. The advanced numbers don't look very good for them either, and yeah, they've missed Jared Allen for some of the games, and they're integrating a lot of new players, obviously bringing in, someone like Max Strus, who's been playing a ton for them, but we talked about this before. There's so much on the line right now for Cleveland in terms of what the season looks like. I mean, if you're a Cavs fan, you go into the playoffs last year, you look like one of the better teams in the East. You win one playoff game, and now here you are. In a couple of months from now, Donovan Mitchell might not be on the roster. Like, that's where they're at right now, and that is a really, really concerning place to be. Now, it's not the end of the world because you still have this really interesting young core, a core that you felt confident enough to trade for Donovan Mitchell in the first place because of those young guys, because of how you thought you could grow the team around him. And that has stagnated certainly a bit since Mitchell has gotten there and since that postseason series last year. And things can always turn around for them this year, but we talked about this in the offseason. They need to, win a playoff series or two with Donovan Mitchell on the roster. And even then, that might not be enough to keep him, because it's clear that there are teams out there, New York, Miami, that are going to really, really want Donovan Mitchell once his contract expires. And if you want to get ahead of that by a year, I wouldn't be surprised at all if, let's say that there's an injury or whatever, and let's say Cleveland is 10 games under 500 in February, they could definitely look at trading Donovan Mitchell to New York, to Miami, to maybe even Philadelphia, who now has that stuff, from the Harden trade. There's going to be options for them out there, and if things continue to go south, that might be something that they need to do, because the worst thing you could do if you're Cleveland is let this situation play out, and like I talked about with Siakam earlier, let Donovan Mitchell leave for nothing, because if you traded him at the deadline this year, you might not get everything back, because Lauri Markkanen ended up being an all-NBA caliber player randomly for Utah, and you traded away multiple firsts. You're probably not getting that back, but you can get a good amount of the draft compensation back that you traded in exchange for Mitchell, and then just continue to build your team the way that maybe you should have prior to the Mitchell trade. But the worst thing you could do is have him leave for nothing and lose the stuff you traded for him and not get anything back for him. And that's why I think they're going to be at least moderately aggressive if the season continues to go poorly as we get closer to the deadline, looking at potentially trading Donovan Mitchell. So it's early in the year, obviously, but these are some guys, in my opinion, that probably need a change of scenery right now.